She didn't even look up when he walked through the door. Ethan Cross had been gone 11 days. 11 days across 3 countries, closing a merger that added $400 million to a portfolio most people couldn't count to. He'd called ahead. His assistant had sent flowers. The penthouse smelled like the arrangement he'd paid $600 for, roses and white orchids arranged in a vase she'd probably Instagrammed without tagging him. Veronica was standing at the window in his bathrobe, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something someone else had said. She saw him. She held up one finger, just a second, and kept laughing. He set his bag down, stood there in the entrance of the home he owned, in the city he helped shape, and waited like a delivery man hoping for a tip. When she finally hung up, she turned and said, "Oh good, you're back. Did you remember to bring the Birkin, the cream one I asked for?" That was the moment. Not a crash, not a confrontation, just a question about a handbag. That was the moment Ethan Cross decided to disappear. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before you keep reading, because what happens next in this story is something you will not want to walk into halfway through. The penthouse was 42 floors above the street, and on a clear night you could see the lights of the city spread out in every direction like something out of a dream someone else was having. Ethan had bought the place 6 years ago for reasons that had more to do with ego than comfort, and in that time he'd learned something important about views from great heights. They looked exactly the same whether you were happy or not. The city didn't care. The lights just kept going. He stood at the window for a long time after Veronica left the room to take another call. The Birkin bag was on the kitchen counter. Cream, with gold hardware, purchased at the last minute through his assistant because he'd remembered 30,000 feet over the Atlantic that Veronica had mentioned it twice in the past month, in the particular tone she used when she wasn't technically asking for something, but absolutely was. The bag had cost more than most people in this country made in 3 months, and he'd bought it without blinking because that was what you did. That was the currency of the life he lived. The problem was, he was beginning to feel like the only thing he'd ever really purchased was performance. Veronica was 29, genuinely beautiful, and possessed of a social intelligence that could read a room faster than any algorithm Ethan had ever funded. She knew which art openings mattered and which charity galas were worth her time. She knew how to dress for photographs and how to make powerful people feel seen. She was, by every measurable standard of the world they moved in, an ideal partner. She was also, Ethan had come to understand slowly and then all at once, not particularly interested in him as a person. This had taken longer to understand than it should have, mostly because the signals had always been wrapped in things that looked like affection. She remembered his preferences at restaurants. She told people in public that she was proud of him. She touched his arm in photographs with a naturalness that felt real in the moment. But when the cameras were gone and the events were over and it was just the two of them in this glass box above the city, there wasn't much left. She'd scroll her phone, he'd read reports. They'd sleep on their respective sides of a bed that cost $20,000 and had never once felt like enough. He thought about the question a lot in the quiet hours. The question that had started as a whisper and groan over the past couple of years into something that kept him awake. Does anyone actually know me? Not Ethan Cross the billionaire. Not Ethan Cross whose name was on 3 buildings and a foundation and a wing of the Children's Hospital downtown. Just Ethan, the man who'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati with a mother who worked nights and a father who left when he was 9 and took most of the furniture with him. The man who'd built his first company in a rented storage unit and eaten peanut butter sandwiches for 8 months straight because he couldn't afford both food and server costs. The man who, if you stripped away the net worth and the addresses and the profile pieces in financial magazines, was honestly not sure what was left. Did anyone know that man? Did anyone love that man? He'd dated women before Veronica who were similarly positioned. There'd been Sophia, who'd cried real tears when he gave her a diamond bracelet and looked at him like he was made of light, and then 3 months later casually mentioned that she'd been telling her friends he was thinking of proposing, which he hadn't been. There'd been Andrea, who was warm and funny and genuinely good company right up until the moment she discovered he wasn't willing to fund her friend's film project, at which point she became cold in a way that answered every question he hadn't known he was asking. There'd been others, a parade of proximity, of people who orbited his wealth the way planets orbit a sun. Not because they chose it, but because it was simply where the gravity pulled. He'd stopped trying to tell the difference. That was the most honest thing he could say about it. He'd stopped expecting something real and started just managing what was in front of him, and at some point that had become his entire emotional life. The night Veronica asked about the handbag, he lay awake until 4 in the morning, not angry at her. She was who she'd always been. He'd known that, but angry at himself. At the particular kind of cowardice that dressed itself up as practicality. At the years he'd spent accepting less than what he actually wanted because he'd convinced himself that what he actually wanted wasn't something men like him got to have. He wanted someone who would notice he was home. He wanted someone who'd ask how he was doing and actually wait for the answer. He wanted, if he was being fully honest in the dark at 4 in the morning, to be loved the way regular people got loved. Not the billboard version. The quiet, inconvenient, real version. The idea came to him the way most of his best ideas did, sideways, when he wasn't trying. I was in the shower the next morning, mechanically going through the routine, and it hit him with a clarity that was almost physical. What if I disappeared? Not forever. Not dramatically. Just, what if Ethan Cross stopped being Ethan Cross for a while and became nobody and saw what happened? What if he found out whether the version of himself that existed without the money, without the name, without the whole architecture of wealth and status? What if he found out whether that version of himself was someone a person could actually love? It was an insane idea. He knew that. He held it up in his mind and looked at it from every angle and acknowledged completely that it was the kind of thing that would get a profile written about it under a headline like, "When Billionaires Break the Mental Health Crisis Nobody Talks About." He was aware. He did it anyway. It took 2 weeks to arrange. He told his executive team he was taking a medical leave, vague enough to stop questions, and handed operational authority to his COO, Margaret Shin, who was more competent than him in most respects anyway, and wouldn't miss the oversight. He moved a modest amount of money into an account with no connection to his name. He bought clothes from a Goodwill 3 towns over, worn jeans, a flannel shirt with a missing button, work boots that had belonged to someone who'd done actual physical labor. He stopped shaving. He let himself look, for the first time in 15 years, like a man who was struggling. He drove south and then west, away from everything that could recognize him, and eventually he ran out of highway. He'd planned to take and just kept going until the city turned to suburb, and the suburb turned to farmland, and the farmland turned into a place called Mill Haven, population 4,000 something, wedged between a river and a ridge of low hills that turned gold in the afternoon light. He'd been driving for 9 hours. He was tired in a way that felt honest. He parked the truck he'd bought with cash, an '09 Ford with a cracked dashboard and a radio that only picked up 2 stations, and walked into the center of Millhaven with a duffel bag and no plan, which was, he reflected, more than a little ironic for a man who'd made his fortune on strategic planning. The town had a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a small park with a gazebo that needed painting. It had the particular quality of places that had been quietly holding on for decades, not thriving, not dying, just persisting with a kind of stubborn dignity. He liked it immediately, which surprised him. He sat on a bench in the park because he didn't know what else to do, and for a while he just watched the town move around him. A woman with a stroller. A teenager on a bicycle who wasn't watching where he was going. 2 old men playing chess under a tree with the absorbed concentration of people who'd been doing it so long they'd stopped needing to talk about it. Nobody looked at him. This was different from what he was used to. In his regular life, being in a public space involved a constant low-level awareness of recognition, people glancing twice, nudging companions, the particular shift in energy that happened when someone placed a face to a name. He'd grown so accustomed to it that its absence now felt like a strange kind of freedom. He was invisible. He was nobody. He was just a tired man sitting on a bench, and the town went about its business without him. He was still sitting there, going on 2 hours, when the kid appeared. He was maybe 9 or 10, brown-haired and gap-toothed, wearing a backpack that was slightly too big for him. He came around the corner of the gazebo at a speed that suggested he was going somewhere specific, and then abruptly stopped when he saw Ethan, and stared for a second with the completely unself-conscious directness that children are capable of before they learn it's rude. You look hungry, the kid said. Ethan blinked. I'm sorry? You look hungry. The kid pulled his backpack around to the front, unzipped it, and rummaged. He produced a slightly squashed peanut butter sandwich in a Ziploc bag and held it out. You can have this. I already ate my apple. Ethan looked at the sandwich. He wasn't actually hungry. He'd eaten at a gas station 2 hours ago. But something about the gesture landed in a place he hadn't expected, somewhere below the level where his defenses usually operated. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, said the kid. I want to. He pushed the bag a little closer. It's peanut butter. Do you have a nut allergy? My friend Marcus is allergic to nuts and his throat closes up. No allergy, Ethan said. Thank you. He took the sandwich. The kid sat down on the bench next to him with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned to perform social anxiety. I'm Noah, he said. What's your name? Ethan. Where are you from? Far away. Noah considered this with a small nod, as if far away was a perfectly satisfactory answer. Did you drive here or walk? Drove. Do you have a place to stay? Ethan looked at him. Not yet. Oh. Noah seemed to think about this. He looked down at his sneakers, which had a cartoon character on the side that Ethan didn't recognize, and then looked back up. My dad takes people in sometimes, people who need a place. He let Mr. Hernandez stay in our barn for almost a whole winter once because Mr. Hernandez hurt his back and couldn't work. He's nice. My dad, I mean. Mr. Hernandez is also nice, but he talks a lot. Your dad sounds like a good man, Ethan said. He is, Noah said simply. No performance in it, just a fact the kid had never seen any reason to complicate. Daniel Carter, it turned out, was exactly what his son had described and also somehow more than that. He was 40-something, lean in the way of men who worked outside, with calloused hands and a face that had spent enough time in weather to show it. He met Ethan at the gate of his property an hour before sunset, after Noah had apparently gone home and reported, without apparent concern, that he'd met a man in the park who needed somewhere to stay, which said something about either the kid's judgment or his father's reputation in this town, possibly both. Daniel looked Ethan over with a directness that wasn't suspicious so much as simply honest. He was the kind of man, Ethan sensed, who made decisions quickly and lived with them. My son says you're passing through, Daniel said, more or less. You need work or you need rest or you need both? Ethan thought about it. Both, probably. Daniel nodded. I've got a room off the back that's nothing fancy. You'd work for board. There's plenty to do around here. I don't need your history. I don't care about your history. But I'll tell you straight, I've got 2 kids and a farm, and I won't have trouble here. You won't have trouble from me, Ethan said. Another look. Longer this time. Then Daniel stepped back from the gate. All right then, come on in. Supper's in 40 minutes. The house was small and worn and absolutely alive with the particular energy of a home that was actually used. Dishes drying on a rack, boots by the door, a coat hung over a chair instead of in a closet, a calendar on the wall with actual handwriting on the dates. Ethan had owned houses that were 3 times the size and 1/10 as full. The girl came in from what appeared to be the back porch while Daniel was showing Ethan the spare room. She stopped in the hallway when she saw him, and there was a beat where she and Ethan just looked at each other. She was in her mid-20s, dark-haired, wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, and she had the kind of face that didn't need anything done to it. She also had the expression of someone who'd just discovered an unexpected variable in a situation she'd thought she understood. Lily, Daniel said, this is Ethan. He's going to be helping out for a while. Ethan, this is my daughter. Hi, she said, in a tone that was friendly enough and also clearly meant I'll be making my own assessment of this situation. Thanks. Hi, Ethan said. Noah told me he found someone, she said to her father. He made it sound like he'd discovered a stray dog. More or less, Daniel said without any apparent irony. Lily looked at Ethan again. Do you know anything about farming? Not much, he admitted. Can you follow instructions? When they're reasonable. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition. Well, she said, that's more than I can say for some people. And then she went past him toward the kitchen, and he could hear her moving things around, starting something on the stove. Supper was soup and bread, and a conversation that moved easily between the 4 of them. Daniel and Lily and Noah and this stranger they'd let in off the road. And nobody asked Ethan for his resume or his references or his net worth or his opinion on monetary policy. Noah asked him whether he'd ever seen a tornado. Lily asked whether he took his coffee with anything. Daniel asked whether his back was up to hauling because there were fence posts that needed moving. He hadn't sat at a table like this in so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. He kept waiting for the catch. The moment when someone would ask for something, reveal the angle, expose the transaction underneath the hospitality. But the catch didn't come. The soup was just soup. The conversation was just conversation. Daniel passed him the bread without any ceremony, and Noah talked about something that had happened at school, and Lily laughed at something her brother said. And for a few minutes, Ethan Cross, who had more money than most small countries, sat in a farmhouse kitchen and felt, for reasons he could not entirely explain, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not yet know how much it was going to cost him. He started work the next morning before the light was fully up, because Daniel was already outside and it felt wrong to sleep while his host was working. The first week was physical in a way that reminded Ethan that he hadn't actually used his body for anything meaningful in years. Hauling fence posts, clearing brush from a drainage ditch, repairing a section of the tool shed roof that had started to sag. He was bad at most of it, and Daniel corrected him with the patient bluntness of a man who had no interest in making him feel worse than necessary. "You're holding the hammer like it's something that might bite you," Daniel observed on the third morning. "I'm not used to hammers," Ethan admitted. "I gathered." Daniel demonstrated the correct grip without comment, the way a man who'd learned everything by doing it showed other people how things worked. "What are you used to?" Ethan thought about this. "Computers, meetings, conference calls." Daniel watched him attempt the grip adjustment. "You must be very good at those things, to need a break from them this badly." It was the first thing Daniel said that had an edge of intuition in it, and Ethan looked up. But Daniel had already moved on to the next section of fence and didn't appear to be waiting for a response. Lily appeared at the farm in the mornings before she went to the diner on Route 9 where she worked the breakfast and lunch shift, and in the evenings when she came back. She was not unfriendly, but she was measured, the kind of woman who'd learned to take her time with things, and that patience showed. She asked him questions sometimes, practical ones mostly, but occasionally something more. "Do you have family somewhere?" she asked him one evening when he was sitting on the back steps watching the last light leave the ridge. "Not much," he said. That was true, at least. His mother had died 4 years ago. There was a sister in Portland he spoke to 3 times a year. "What about someone waiting for you? Wife? Girlfriend?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of nothing for a grown man to be carrying around. He looked over at her. She was watching the ridge too, her coffee cup held in both hands. "Yeah," he said. "I'm working on that." He wasn't sure what he meant by it exactly, but she seemed to consider it a reasonable answer. The man arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a car that cost more than anything else on the street, which in Millhaven was a statement. It was a black Mercedes, too shiny, too large, the kind of vehicle that announced itself. The man who got out of it was maybe 45, well-dressed in an effortful way, with the bearing of someone who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him and occasionally forgot to let them. Victor Hayes was, by any conventional measure, successful. He owned a regional development company, had built or bought half the commercial real estate in the county, and had been pursuing Lily Carter, in one form or another, for 2 years. He came by the diner where she worked and ordered things he didn't want just to have a reason to talk to her. He brought her gifts. He spoke to her father with the careful deference of a man who understood he was being auditioned and was willing to perform. Lily tolerated him with a politeness that was, if you watched carefully, a form of exhaustion. Ethan was splitting wood in the side yard when Victor arrived that Thursday. He heard the car, saw it pull up, watched the man climb out. Victor noticed him immediately, the way men like that always noticed unfamiliar elements in spaces they'd decided were theirs, and his expression did a quick, small recalibration. "You working here?" Victor said, not unpleasant, but not trying to be. "Yes," Ethan said. "New?" "A couple weeks." Victor nodded, looked at the house, looked back at Ethan. There was something in his assessment, thorough, fast, dismissive, that Ethan recognized without effort. He'd done it himself, in other contexts. The calculation a certain kind of man runs when he's deciding whether someone is a threat or an irrelevance. Victor decided irrelevance and walked up to the front door. From where he was standing, Ethan could hear the conversation through the screen, or the beginning of it. Lily's voice, careful and even. Victor's, warmer than necessary, offering something. Dinner, he thought, or an event of some kind. A gala benefiting something in the county seat. He had access to the tables. He'd reserved 2 seats in her name. A pause. Then Lily, Victor, I've told you before. Victor, I know, but this is different. This isn't a date. It's a community event. It would be good for you to be there. Good for her. The phrase landed funny, even from a distance. Lily, I appreciate the offer. I can't make it. You could make it. You're choosing not to. A longer pause this time. I suppose I am, Lily said. Her voice had gone quieter, which Ethan was already learning meant not softness, but a kind of final settling. I'm sorry, Victor. The screen door opened, and then closed, and then opened again, and Victor came out, and his face had reorganized itself into something that was still composed, but only just. He crossed the yard toward his car, and as he passed Ethan, he stopped. Word of advice, Victor said, and his tone had changed, the warmth gone, something more honest underneath it. In this town, people's circumstances change, sometimes fast. You do well to make sure you're on the right side of things. Ethan looked at him. Let the silence sit for a moment. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Victor got in the car and drove away, and Ethan went back to the woodpile and split the next log a little harder than he needed to. That evening, Noah sat next to him on the porch steps after supper, and they looked at the stars, which in Millhaven were remarkably clear for reasons that probably had to do with the absence of the light pollution. Ethan had grown so accustomed to that he'd forgotten stars could look like that. Do you like it here? Noah asked. Ethan thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said, I do. Better than where you were before? In a lot of ways. Noah seemed satisfied by that. He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them. Lily likes you, he said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a weather pattern. How do you figure that? She asks about you, when you're not around. Noah shrugged. She doesn't ask about Victor, and he comes here all the time. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Your sister, he said finally, seems like a very sensible person. She is, Noah said. She says feelings are like weather. They're going to happen whether you plan for them or not, so you might as well pay attention. Ethan looked at the kid. 9 years old, gap-toothed, sitting there with a wisdom borrowed from someone else and delivered with absolute confidence. That's good advice, Ethan said. I know, said Noah. She has a lot of good advice. She just doesn't always take it herself. He laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that surprised him because he hadn't expected it. Noah grinned, pleased, and they sat together a while longer while the stars did what they always did, which was absolutely nothing, and somehow that was enough. Later, lying in the narrow bed in the small room that smelled like lumber and old fabric, Ethan Cross stared at the ceiling and acknowledged to himself, with the quiet certainty of a man who'd spent years misreading the signals that mattered, that something in this town had begun to undo him. Not in a bad way. In the way that things come undone when they've been held too tight for too long. He was also beginning to understand that the longer he stayed without telling the truth, the worse the eventual reckoning was going to be. He told himself he'd tell them soon. He didn't. The thing about living a lie is that it gets easier before it gets harder. In the first few weeks, Ethan woke every morning with a low-grade awareness of what he was doing. The deliberate omission, the manufactured identity, the version of himself he was presenting to people who deserved the full truth. He'd lie in the narrow bed and run through it like a checklist. No phone calls to anyone who knew him, no credit cards, no slip of name or habit that might crack the surface. It required a kind of vigilance that was exhausting in a way his actual life had never been, because his actual life had never required him to remember who he was supposed to be. But then something shifted, and he stopped thinking of it as maintenance. He just started being there. The farm had a rhythm that imposed itself on everything, up before light because the animals didn't care about your schedule. Coffee in the kitchen while Daniel read yesterday's paper because the Wi-Fi was slow and he'd given up waiting for today's. Breakfast fast and functional, eggs, toast, whatever Lily had made before she left for the diner. Then out into the morning while the dew was still on the grass, and the day would organize itself around what needed doing, and there was always something that needed doing, which Ethan found, unexpectedly, to be one of the most restful things he'd ever experienced. He'd spent 15 years in a world where the problems were abstract: market positions, regulatory frameworks, the feelings of shareholders who owned fractions of things and had opinions about all of it. The problems on Daniel's farm were concrete. The fence was broken, or it wasn't. The roof leaked, or it didn't. The soil in the east field needed turning, and if you turned it correctly, you could feel the difference in your hands. He was getting better with his hands. Daniel noticed without making a production of it, which was his way. One morning, about 3 weeks in, he watched Ethan restring a section of wire fence with something approaching actual competence and said, simply, "You're learning." Then he picked up the other end and they finished the section without needing to say anything else. And Ethan thought about how rarely silence had ever felt like that, like a form of companionship rather than an absence of connection. "You ever work outdoors before?" Daniel asked that evening, when they were cleaning up after a long day that had included the fence, a drainage issue near the south pasture, and the discovery that something had gotten into the equipment shed and needed to be encouraged to leave. "Not really," Ethan said. "I grew up in a city." I could tell, at first. Daniel poured himself a glass of water from the tap and leaned against the counter. "You held tools the way someone holds them when they've seen pictures of people holding tools but never actually done it. That's an accurate description. You're not doing that anymore." Ethan looked at his hands. They were different now, rougher, with a callus forming at the base of each finger where the tools had taught him their shapes. He hadn't noticed the change as it was happening. He'd just woken up one morning with hands that looked like they'd been used for something. "The work helps," he said. "I think I needed to do something with my hands for a while." Daniel nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My father used to say that the body knows things the mind hasn't caught up to yet. You give the body something to do, sometimes it figures things out." Ethan thought about that later and decided it was true. The thing his body was in the process of figuring out was Lily Carter, which was inconvenient timing given everything else. It didn't happen the way attraction usually happened to him, which in his previous life had tended to be immediate and uncomplicated and ultimately shallow, a response to surface things, to the performance of desirability. With Lily, it was slower and more confusing and arrived in pieces, like furniture delivered to the wrong door that gradually, item by item, turned out to belong exactly where it was. He noticed her competence first, because it was impossible to miss. She ran the morning shift at the diner with a quiet efficiency that made it look effortless, which meant it was the opposite of effortless. It meant she'd done it so many times and so well that all the effort had been absorbed into muscle memory. She handled difficult customers without losing her patience, which Ethan recognized as a skill that required far more self-control than most people gave it credit for. She managed her father's household accounts in the evenings, not because Daniel couldn't do it, but because she was better at it, and they both knew it, and neither of them made a thing of it. She was 26, and she had been managing things since her mother died when she was 19, which Noah had told him in the casual way children relay information they don't fully understand the weight of. "Mom got sick," Noah had said. "Lily came home from college to help. Then Mom died and Lily just stayed." He'd said it looking out the window, like it was something he'd always known and didn't have strong feelings about, which probably meant he had very strong feelings about it that he'd learned not to show. Ethan had not asked Lily about it directly. It wasn't his information to ask for, but he found himself noticing the moments when it surfaced in her. The way she sometimes stopped in the middle of something and went briefly somewhere else before coming back. The way she could be in the middle of laughing and then look at her father with an expression that was something close to grief folded up small and put in a pocket. She'd given up a lot, and she had not, as far as he could see, spent much time being sorry for herself about it. He was trying to find a moment to tell her that he found this extraordinary, and not finding one that didn't seem either too large or too obvious, when the evening came that changed the temperature of things between them. It was raining. One of those late-season rains that came in off the hills without warning and turned the dirt road to mud and drummed against the tin roof of the tool shed with a noise that made conversation difficult. Ethan had been caught out in it, returning from closing up the chicken coop, and by the time he got back to the house, he was soaked through in the way that's funny in retrospect and miserable in the moment. Lily was at the kitchen table when he came in through the back door, dripping on the mat, and she looked up from the account ledger and pressed her lips together against a laugh that escaped anyway. "You look like you lost an argument with the weather," she said. "The weather didn't give me a chance to argue," he said. "It just made its position known." She got up and went to the hall closet without being asked, and came back with a towel, not the fancy kind, the practical kind, worn thin from use, and handed it to him. He took it. Then she went to the stove and put the kettle on, and that small sequence of actions, the noticing, the getting up, the kettle, hit him in a place he hadn't expected. Someone had noticed he was cold, without being asked, without any angle to it. He sat down at the other end of the table while the rain kept going and she went back to the ledger, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was becoming one of his favorite things about this house. That silence in it didn't need to be filled. "These numbers are wrong," she said eventually, more to herself than to him, tracing a column with her finger. "Which column?" She looked up. "You can read a ledger?" "I can read a ledger," he said, which was something of an understatement. He'd read ledgers for companies with revenue in the billions, but he said it carefully. She turned the book toward him without ceremony and pointed. He leaned over and looked. There was a transposition error in the third column, material costs for the season, which had propagated forward and created a discrepancy that looked worse than it was. "There," he said, pointing at it. "You've got 847 written as 487. Everything downstream is off because of that." She looked at where he was pointing. Then she took the pencil from behind her ear and corrected it and ran the column again in her head, lips moving slightly. "You're right," she said, and looked at him. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Old job," he said. "What kind of old job?" "Finance," which was, technically, not a lie. She studied him for a second longer than was casual. She did this sometimes, a focused look that lasted just long enough to communicate that she was paying genuine attention, that she wasn't going to be easily fooled, that she was interested in the truth even if she wasn't going to demand it. He found this quality both admirable and deeply uncomfortable, for obvious reasons. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly. When Noah came home and told us he'd found somebody in the park who needed help, I thought—" She stopped. "Actually, I thought Dad would let you stay for a week, and that would be the end of it. That's usually how it goes." "But," he said, "but you've been here a month and a half, and you fix things before Dad has to ask, and you've taught Noah how to identify 3 different birds by their call, and you don't complain about the work, and I can't quite figure out what your actual story is." She said this directly, without apology. "People who run away from something usually let it show eventually. You're not showing it." He held her gaze. The rain was loud on the roof. The kettle had started to whistle, and she got up to deal with it, giving him a moment he was grateful for because his chest had done something complicated at the phrase, "people who run away from something." "Maybe I'm running towards something instead," he said when she came back with 2 mugs. She set one in front of him and sat down again. "That's a nicer way to think about it," she said. There was something careful in her voice now, something that recognized it had gotten closer to something real than she'd maybe intended. "Lily." He didn't know what he was going to say after her name, and so he stopped. "Don't," she said, and it wasn't unkind. "I'm not in a hurry. Whatever it is can wait until you know what it is." He wrapped his hands around the mug. Outside, the rain kept falling. He thought that he was without question falling in love with her, and also that he had no right to, and also that it had already happened, and there was nothing he could do about the timing. Victor came back on a Saturday, and this time he brought a woman Ethan didn't recognize, older, well-dressed, with the manner of someone who was accustomed to deciding things on behalf of other people. Victor introduced her as his aunt, which may have been true. He brought flowers for Lily and wine for Daniel and a toy of some kind for Noah that was expensive enough to be slightly uncomfortable. Ethan watched this from a distance, working near the barn, and tried to assess his own reaction, which was not charitable. He recognized jealousy because he'd felt it before, and he recognized the particular flavor of it that came from watching someone try to buy something that shouldn't be for sale. Daniel accepted the wine with the grace of a man who knew how to be polite without being won over. Noah accepted the toy with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child. Lily accepted the flowers and said thank you and put them in water, and then stood in the kitchen doorway talking to Victor's aunt with a composure that Ethan was learning was her default mode of dealing with things she'd rather not be dealing with. Victor eventually made his way across the yard to where Ethan was working, with the practiced casualness of a man who'd decided to do something he'd already decided on. "You're still here," Victor said. "Still here," Ethan agreed. "Daniel must be happy for the help." He said this with a tone that was almost entirely neutral, and therefore communicating several things at once. Farm like this is hard to manage short-handed. "He seems to manage fine." "Sure." Victor put his hands in his pockets. "I was looking at the house, not at Ethan." "Lily's a remarkable woman. You've probably figured that out." Ethan didn't say anything. "I've known her for 2 years," Victor continued. "She's careful. Takes a long time to trust people. But when she does," he let that hang. "Well, just something to be aware of." Ethan set down the tool he was holding and turned to face him properly. "Are you warning me or informing me?" Victor smiled at that, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Just making conversation," he said. He looked at Ethan with that same quick, evaluating look he'd used on their first meeting, and something in it was different this time. Less dismissive, more calculating. "What was it you said you did before this?" "I didn't say." "Right." Victor nodded slowly. "No, you didn't." He glanced toward the house one more time. "Well, enjoy the afternoon." He walked back toward the house and Ethan watched him go. And the feeling he was left with wasn't quite dread, but it was in the neighborhood of it. That night, after Victor and his aunt had gone and Noah was in bed, Ethan sat with Daniel on the porch while the evening cooled. Daniel had the particular quality of comfortable company that doesn't require conversation, and for a while they were just two men sitting in the dark with the sounds of the farm around them. "He's going to keep coming back," Ethan said eventually. Daniel didn't pretend not to know who he meant. "Probably." "Does that bother you?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. Victor Hayes is a man who has learned that most things can be had if you're patient and persistent enough about it. He's right about that mostly. He's wrong about Lily. He paused. Lily is like her mother in that way. Once she decides a thing, that's the thing. You can push all you want, and the decision just gets quieter and harder. She decided about Victor. Long time ago. Daniel looked at him sideways. She hasn't decided about you yet. That's different. Ethan didn't know what to do with that, so he sat with it. "Daniel," he said after a while, "I need to tell you something at some point, something about where I came from." Daniel looked at him steadily. In the low light, his face was patient, unhurried, the face of a man who'd received difficult news before and knew how to hold himself around it. "When you're ready," Daniel said, "it's not as simple as I've made it seem. Most things aren't." He turned back to the darkness of the yard. "I knew that before you said it. You've got the look of somebody carrying something specific. I've been waiting for you to figure out when to put it down." Ethan's chest was tight. "You're not angry?" "I don't know enough to be angry yet." Daniel's voice was even and entirely sincere. "Whatever it is, you're still the man who's been here the past 6 weeks doing right by this family. That's not nothing. Whatever comes after it, well, we'll deal with that when it comes." He should have told him then. He had the opening, the tone was right. Daniel was in exactly the frame of mind to receive it. All he had to do was say the words. He didn't say them. He told himself it was because the moment wasn't fully right, because he wanted more time to think about how to frame it, because he needed to be sure. These were all true things, and they were also all rationalizations, and he knew it, and he let himself believe them anyway, because the thought of watching Daniel's expression change and Lily's trust evaporate was something he didn't yet know how to make himself do. So he said, "Thank you, Daniel," and meant it, and the evening settled around them, and the farm went quiet the way it went quiet at the end of every day, and he sat there a while longer than he should have, in the warmth of something he knew he was borrowing time on. The shift between them, between Ethan and Lily, happened without announcement, the way real shifts do. Not a conversation, not a moment you could point to and say there, just a gradual recalibration of how they moved around each other. She stopped treating him like a temporary variable and started treating him like something that belonged to the equation. He started saying things he meant instead of things that were safe. They argued once about the best way to repair the garden fence, which was genuinely a disagreement and not a performance. And neither of them backed down easily, and afterwards both of them were slightly more relaxed around each other in a way that hadn't been there before. Sometimes that's how it goes. You argue with someone and discover they can take it, and something loosens. He found her one morning sitting on the back steps with her coffee going cold in her hands. And she had that look she got sometimes, the going somewhere else look. He sat down next to her without asking and didn't say anything. After a while she said, "My mom would have liked you." He looked at her. "She liked people who were actually paying attention," Lily said. "She used to say most people are in the room but not really in the room. She had no patience for that." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that comes with weight behind it. "I have no patience for it either. It's probably the most inconvenient thing she gave me." "Why inconvenient?" "Because it means you notice when people are real and when they aren't. And once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. And there are a lot of people who aren't." She looked at him. "You're in the room. I noticed that first." He thought about the distance between in the room and telling the truth, and how those could be two different things, and how one of them was true of him and the other wasn't, and said nothing. "I haven't been this honest with anyone in a long time," she said, and looked slightly annoyed at herself for it. "That's probably more than I should have said." "No," he said, "it's not." She looked at him for a long moment and then looked away, and picked up her coffee and found it cold and made a face and got up to reheat it, and that was the end of that conversation, but it wasn't the end of what had been said. He watched her go back inside and thought, tell her. Today. Right now. Go in there and tell her. He didn't. He stayed on the back steps in the morning air and let the moment pass, and told himself tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that. And each day the lie grew not larger but deeper, the way roots grow, quietly, invisibly, working their way into the ground until they're holding something so firmly that pulling them up becomes its own kind of destruction. Noah, who had the infuriating clarity of someone who hadn't yet learned to complicate things, said to him one afternoon while they were mending a section of pasture fence, "You like Lily." "She's a good person," Ethan said carefully. "That's not what I said." Noah handed him a wire clip without being asked, which meant he'd learned the sequence of the task. "I said you like her. Like her." "You're 9. I'm 10, Noah said with dignity, "and I know what I see." Ethan tightened the wire. "What do you see?" "I see you looking at her when she's not looking, and I see her looking at you when you're not looking." He considered this. "It's kind of annoying, actually. Just look at each other." Ethan laughed, which surprised him. "It's more complicated than that." "Why?" He thought about how to answer honestly without answering fully. "Because I haven't been completely straight with your family about some things." Noah thought about this seriously, the way he thought about most things. "Are you a bad person?" "No?" "Then tell them the thing and fix it." Ethan looked at him. 10 years old, wire clip in one hand, looking back at him with the absolute conviction of someone who hadn't yet learned that some truths, once said, rearranged everything permanently and not always in ways you could predict or manage. "I will," Ethan said. And he meant it. He fully, completely meant it. He was going to tell them. He'd decided. He knew it had gone on too long already, knew that every additional day was a deeper problem, knew that if it came out some other way, and some part of him, the part that had built a career on risk assessment, had always understood that it would come out some other way. The damage would be far worse than if he simply did it himself. He was going to tell them. He had the words arranged in his head. He was ready. I was still ready 3 days later when a black SUV he didn't recognize idled on the road outside the farm property for the better part of an afternoon, and the man behind the wheel had a camera with a long lens, and by the time Ethan noticed it, the man was already gone. He should have told them on a Tuesday. He'd had the words ready, the moment picked. After supper, when Noah was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Daniel was on his second cup of coffee, and the evening was soft enough that hard things felt survivable. He'd actually gotten as far as sitting down across from Daniel with the specific weight of someone about to say something real. Then Noah had knocked his math book off the table, and the moment broke apart, and Ethan told himself he'd do it Thursday instead. Thursday came and went. The black SUV he'd seen idling on the road that afternoon had unsettled him in a way he couldn't name precisely but recognized instinctively. It had the feel of surveillance, the particular stillness of a vehicle that's there on purpose. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself the same thing the next day when he noticed a different car parked near the diner at the end of Lily's shift, just sitting. And the day after that when his phone, The burner he kept powered off in the bottom of his duffel bag buzzed twice with a number he didn't recognize. He turned it back off and tried to decide how worried to be. The answer was more worried than he'd let himself become. It broke on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the SUV, the way these things tend to break. Not gradually, but all at once, the way a window cracks under pressure and then, without warning, gives way completely. Lily was at the diner. Daniel was in the south field. Noah was at school. Ethan was repairing the hinge on the equipment shed when he heard a vehicle coming down the dirt road faster than people came down that road, and he looked up and saw the truck, not one he recognized, pull up to the gate. A man got out with the brisk efficiency of someone running on someone else's clock. He had a manila envelope in one hand. Ethan set down the screwdriver. The man saw him across the yard and changed direction without breaking stride. "You Ethan Cross?" he said when he was close enough. There it was. Not a question, really. The tone of a man who already knew the answer and was giving him a chance to confirm it. "What's this about?" Ethan said. The man held out the envelope. "My employer wanted you to have this." Ethan didn't take it immediately. "Who's your employer?" "I'm not authorized to say." He pushed the envelope a little closer. "He said you'd know." Ethan took it. The man walked back to his truck and left without another word, and the dust from the road settled in his wake, and Ethan stood in the yard holding the envelope for a moment before he opened it. Inside were photographs. 8 of them, clear, well-composed, taken with a telephoto lens by someone who knew what they were doing. Ethan at the fence line with Daniel. Ethan and Noah in the yard. Ethan talking to Lily on the back steps. That morning, the one where she'd told him her mother would have liked him. There was a close-up from that day, angled from the road, that got both their faces clearly. There was also a printout, a single page, professionally formatted, that began with his full legal name, his company name, his estimated net worth, according to the most recent Forbes estimate, and a brief biography that read like something pulled from a financial press profile, which was probably exactly what it was. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in a clean, deliberate script, "Does she know who she's talking to? Victor." It didn't even need a signature. Ethan stood there in the morning light, holding the photographs, and felt the cold clarity of a situation that has stopped being theoretical. Victor had hired someone to find out who he was. Of course he had. He'd been suspicious since the first week, and Ethan had seen it and noted it and told himself he'd handle it before it became a problem, which was exactly the kind of thing you told yourself when you were too comfortable to act. He stood there for another full minute, trying to calculate. He was good at calculating. He'd spent his career running outcomes, modeling variables, mapping risk against return. He ran it now, and every path led to the same place. This was going to get out. Victor had the information. The question wasn't whether the Carters would find out. They would find out. It was only how. He should go inside. He should sit down at that kitchen table and call Daniel in from the field and wait for Lily to come home from the diner, and he should put the photographs on the table and say, "This is who I am. I should have told you before now. I'm sorry." He was moving toward the house with that intention when the second vehicle appeared. Not one this time. 2. A news van from the county affiliate station and a car behind it that he identified, with a sick lurch, as belonging to someone from a regional paper. The kind of paper that didn't usually cover anything this far out, but would absolutely make the trip for Billionaire hiding in plain sight. Victor hadn't just hired a private investigator. He'd fed the story. He'd given it to people with cameras. Ethan stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the yard and watched the van park on the road, and a woman climb out with a microphone and a cameraman behind her. And he understood that the timeline he'd been telling himself he had, the one where he controlled how this came out, where he got to choose the moment and the words and was present to manage the reactions, was gone. It was already done. He went inside the house and called Daniel in from the field. Then he called the diner. Lily answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the background noise of the late breakfast rush. "Something's happened," he said. "You need to come home." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No, but you need to come home. Both of you." He heard her tell someone she'd be back in an hour, and then the line shifted as she moved somewhere quieter. "Ethan, what's going on?" "I'll explain when you get here. I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." Another pause. Longer. That's not a sentence that makes me feel good about things. I know, he said. I'm sorry. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table and waited, and the waiting was the worst thing. Daniel came in from the field first, boots muddy, reading Ethan's face the way you read weather. That bad? Daniel said. Sit down, Ethan said. Please. Daniel sat. Ethan put the photographs on the table between them, laid them out one by one, then the printout. He watched Daniel look at them with a stillness that was its own form of reaction, the stillness of a man who had learned somewhere along the way to hold himself together first and feel it later. Daniel looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at the printout. He read through it with the methodical attention of someone who didn't intend to skim anything important. When he finished, he set it down on the table and folded his hands on top of it, and looked at Ethan with an expression that was hard to read exactly, but not hard to feel. How much? Daniel said. Not the net worth question. That was on the page. Something else. Ethan understood. All of it, he said. From the beginning. My name, my company, everything. Daniel nodded once, slowly. The clothes, the truck, the whole... Yes. A long pause. Why? Daniel said. Not angry yet, just asking. And Ethan told him. He told him the real version, the one that started with Veronica and the Birkin bag and a 4 a.m. moment of clarity in a penthouse 42 floors above a city that didn't know his name from anyone. He told him about the question he'd been carrying, whether anyone could love the man without the money, and how he'd made the decision to find out. He told him about driving until he ran out of road, about Noah in the park with a peanut butter sandwich, about walking through that gate. He didn't make it sound better than it was. He didn't dress it up. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, he could hear the news van still parked on the road, and he thought distantly that they were probably filming the house from out there, probably already had enough for a segment. You let us believe you were someone else, Daniel said finally. Yes. For 2 months. Yes. While my daughter... He stopped, pressed his lips together. While my family treated you like you were one of us. There was no answer to that. Ethan didn't try to give one. I was going to tell you, he said. I kept meaning to. I know how that sounds. It sounds like what it is, Daniel said. Not cruel, exact. A man who made a choice every day to keep not telling the truth. He looked at the photographs again. Who are these from? Victor Hayes. He had someone follow me. I think he fed it to the press outside. Something moved through Daniel's expression, a brief hot flash of anger that had nothing to do with Ethan. Then it settled back into the stillness. Of course he did, Daniel said quietly. The back door opened and Lily came in. She was still in her diner uniform, had come straight from her shift, and she had the look of someone who'd spent the 20-minute drive preparing herself for something difficult without knowing what shape it was going to be. She saw Daniel first, his face, and then she saw the photographs on the table and she stopped. She didn't come all the way into the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and she looked at the photographs, and Ethan watched her take in the printout without picking it up. He watched her read his name, his company, the number. He watched something change in her face. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, but quietly, the way a room changes when the light shifts. How long have you known? She asked. She was looking at the photographs, not at him. I always knew, he said. I came here already knowing. I created the situation. It was deliberate. She looked up then. Her eyes were steady and dark, and he could not read everything in them, but he could read enough. You chose to lie to us, she said. I chose to find out if... Yes, I lied. Every day I was here. The finances question, she said, the ledger. You weren't helping me. You were doing something you already knew how to do perfectly well. Yes. The fence work, all the things where you seemed like you were learning, some of that was real, he said. I didn't know how to work with my hands. I genuinely didn't. But the rest was, I knew things, and I let you think I didn't. She nodded, very slowly. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, not next to Ethan, but across from him, and she put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment before she looked at him again. Why? She said. The same question Daniel had asked, but different. His had been asking for the history. Hers was asking for something else, whether there was something underneath the lie that could justify the shape of it. He told her what he'd told Daniel, but he told her more this time because she deserved more. He told her about the women before Veronica and the pattern he'd recognized too late each time. He told her about lying in the dark at 4 in the morning, not knowing who he was without the money. He told her that he'd driven until he didn't know where he was, and he'd found this town, and her brother had given him a sandwich, and her father had opened a gate, and he'd walked in, and for the first time in years, he'd felt something that wasn't performance. He told her that the feelings had been real, that nothing he'd felt while he was here had been manufactured or strategic, that he hadn't planned to fall in love with her family or with her, that it had just happened, the way things happened when you stopped performing and started actually being somewhere. He said the word, love, and he watched her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't move at all for a moment. Then she looked at the window, at the road where the news van was still parked. "Victor did this?" she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Because you were in the way." "I think so." She was quiet for a long time. Daniel hadn't moved. The refrigerator hummed. A truck went past on the road outside. "I believe you," Lily said finally, "about the feelings being real. I believe that." Something in his chest loosened. "But that's not the problem," she said, and the looser thing tightened again. "The problem is that I told you things I haven't told very many people. I sat on those steps, and I told you about my mother, and I told you what I value, and I thought I was talking to someone I was getting to know honestly. I thought the honesty was going both ways." "Lily, let me finish." Her voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was the voice of someone who was keeping herself very together about something that was actually devastating her. "I don't talk easily. You know that about me. It took you 6 weeks, and that's fast for me. I thought it was because I thought I had good instincts about you." She stopped. "And maybe I did. Maybe my instincts were right about the feelings and wrong about who I was actually dealing with. I don't know how to sort that out right now." "I understand." "Do you?" She looked at him now with something that wasn't anger, which he would have preferred to what it actually was, which was a kind of clear-eyed grief. "Because you've known who you are this whole time. You got to decide what to show and what to keep. We didn't get that. We just trusted you." He didn't have an answer to that. There wasn't one. "I need you to go," she said. I don't mean forever. I don't know what I mean. I just need you to not be in this house right now while I try to figure out how I feel about what you just told me." "Okay," he said. He stood up. He looked at Daniel, who was still sitting with his hands folded on the printout, and Daniel looked back at him with an expression that wasn't hate and wasn't forgiveness and wasn't anything clean or simple. It was the expression of a man who was in the middle of something and hadn't gotten to the other side yet. "Daniel," Ethan said, "I'm sorry, for what it's worth." "I'll let you know what it's worth when I figure that out," Daniel said. Not unkind, true. Ethan went to the spare room and packed the duffel bag, and that was when it hit him, the full weight of it, because the room had become a room he knew. The particular slant of morning light through that window, the way the floorboard creaked near the door, the smell of the house that had gotten into the fabric of the things he kept there. He stood in the middle of it for a moment with his bag in his hand and felt the specific grief of leaving a place that had made you real. He came back through the kitchen. Lily was standing at the counter with her back to him. Daniel was still at the table. "Noah," he started. "I'll handle Noah," Daniel said. He nodded. He went out the back door the way he'd come in that first evening, and he walked across the yard he'd worked in for 2 months, and he heard the television van on the road start up as he came around the side of the house, and he ignored it completely, got in his truck, and pulled away. The story ran that evening on the regional affiliate and was picked up overnight by national outlets, and by morning it was everywhere. The angle that journalists had been dreaming of. Billionaire goes undercover in small town, local family taken in. The framing was exactly what he would have predicted and exactly as reductive as he'd feared. The diner appeared in a photograph. The farm appeared in a photograph. Lily's name appeared in the third paragraph, described as the farmer's daughter, which made him want to put his fist through something. He drove 40 miles to a town large enough to have a hotel and checked in under his own name for the first time in 2 months. And the woman at the front desk recognized him in the tentative way people recognized faces from screens. And he smiled at her with the practiced, empty ease of his public self, and she gave him his key, and he went upstairs and sat on the edge of a bed that cost $800 a night and stared at a wall. His phone had 87 messages. He read none of them. His COO had texted 3 times asking whether he was all right. His publicist had sent a paragraph of recommended language for any statements he wished to make. His sister in Portland had sent only, "I saw. Call me when you can." He didn't call anyone. He sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Noah. Noah, who had decided in 30 seconds that a stranger on a bench was someone worth feeding. Noah, who had taught himself to identify birds by watching and listening because nobody had asked him to. He'd just decided it was interesting. Noah, who had looked at the complex situation between Ethan and Lily and reduced it, with devastating accuracy, to just look at each other. He wondered what Noah was being told tonight. He wondered if Daniel had found the right words, or if there were no right words for a 10-year-old who'd decided someone was his friend and then had to recalibrate that decision based on information that wasn't his fault to receive. He wondered if Noah would understand eventually. He hoped. He had no way to know. Around midnight, he called his attorney, Martin Webb, who had been his attorney since the first company and who had the quality Ethan had always valued most in counsel. He did not editorialize. He did not say, "I told you so," even when he told him so. He simply took the information and converted it into a plan. "Victor Hayes," Martin said when Ethan had laid out the situation. "Development company, county level. You're sure it was him?" The envelope came from someone working for him. The photographs, the timing, it's him. "Okay." A pause, the sound of Martin typing. "You want to pursue this or manage it?" "I want to make sure he can't use what he has to hurt them," Ethan said. "The family. I don't care about myself. Whatever he does to my reputation, I probably deserve most of it. But if he uses that footage or those photographs or whatever else he has to go after Daniel Carter or his daughter." "Understood," Martin said, in his clean, useful way. "I'll look at what exposure he has. If he fed material to press with the intent to harm a private individual, there are avenues. And the press itself, I want it on the record that the family had no knowledge. If anything runs that implies they were complicit or that this was some kind of arrangement, we'll get that corrected," Martin said. "Are you issuing a statement?" Ethan thought about it. He thought about the language his publicist had prepared and how it would sound: professional, measured, designed to minimize damage to the cross-group brand. He thought about how completely different that version of him felt from the one who'd been standing in the yard at 6 in the morning, watching the light come over the ridge. "Yes," he said, "but I'm writing it myself." He spent an hour on it. He didn't hide anything that mattered. He said that he'd made a choice to find out something he needed to know, and that in doing so, he'd used people who'd trusted him without telling them the full truth. He said that was wrong. He didn't qualify it or explain it in ways designed to make himself look better. He said the Carter family were people of exceptional character who had extended generosity to a stranger with no expectation of anything in return, and that they bore absolutely no responsibility for any aspect of what he'd done or not done. He said, "I owe them more than a statement. I'm aware of that." He sent it to Martin to release in the morning, and then he turned off the light and lay in the expensive dark and thought about a woman sitting on some back steps with cold coffee in her hand, saying, "You're in the room," like it was the best thing she could say about a person. He understood now how it was possible to know the exact right thing to do and to not do it anyway. He understood it the way you understood things that had happened to you rather than things you'd read about. He'd known for weeks he needed to tell the truth. He'd been ready multiple times. He'd let comfort make him cowardly, and the people who'd trusted him had paid the price for that, and no statement, however honest, was going to put back what his silence had cost. 2 days went by, then 3. He did not go back to Millhaven, though he was 40 miles away, and there was nothing physically stopping him. He was stopping himself because showing up uninvited after being asked to leave would be exactly the kind of thing a man who still thought in terms of what he wanted would do. And he was trying, however imperfectly, to think instead about what they needed. What they needed was probably time. What he was learning, sitting in a hotel room, reading none of his 87 messages, and turning down 2 interview requests, and eating room service he didn't taste, was that there was a particular kind of loneliness specific to having had something real and lost it. He'd spent years lonely in the other way, the way of being surrounded by people who didn't see you, and he'd learned to manage that, to build a life inside it. This was different. This was the loneliness of a specific absence, the chair at the table that was now empty, the yard in the morning where he wasn't working, the step where two people had sat with coffee and told each other things they meant. He felt it the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, returning to it, pressing against the space, unable to stop because the absence had its own texture. On the fourth day, his phone rang with a Millhaven area code that wasn't the Carter's number, and he answered it out of reflex. It was the owner of the hardware store on Main Street, a man named Carol, who Ethan had spoken to maybe 3 times. His voice was tight. "I don't know if you know," Carol said, "but there was trouble at the Carter farm last night. Someone cut their fence line on the east side, let the animals into the road. Daniel was out there at 2 in the morning trying to sort it." Ethan was already standing. "Was anyone hurt?" "Not last night. But there's been other things. Someone drove through their yard the night before. The kind of thing that's not quite a crime because nothing got broken, but people are saying Hayes is behind it. He's angry about that statement you put out, and he's—" Carol stopped. "I don't know why I'm calling you. I just thought you should know." "I'm glad you called," Ethan said. "Thank you." He hung up and called Martin Webb. He was very calm about it, which was a thing that happened to him when situations became clear. The noise reduced, and he could see exactly what needed to happen. He gave Martin the details. Martin said, "Leave it with me." Ethan said, "Don't leave it. Move on it today." Then he sat back down on the edge of the expensive bed and thought about Daniel Carter out in the dark at 2 in the morning chasing animals off the road. And the cold, specific anger he felt was something he recognized from a long time ago. Before the money, before any of it. From being a kid in a 2-bedroom apartment who'd figured out early that the only reliable response to the world not being fair was to do something about it. He'd gotten soft. He'd let the money make him passive, let it be the thing that handled things instead of him. That was over now. Victor Hayes had made a very straightforward mistake. He'd looked at Ethan Cross standing in a farmyard with calloused hands and worn boots, and decided he was looking at a man who could be managed. He was not looking at a man who could be managed. I was looking at a man who had spent 20 years building things from nothing and who now had every resource he'd built and a reason to use them, and who was done, completely and finally done, letting the people he loved absorb the cost of other people's cruelty. He checked out of the hotel the next morning and got in his truck and drove back toward Millhaven, and the road looked different from the direction he'd come from. Like something he was going back to rather than something he was leaving, which was a distinction that mattered more than it might sound. He didn't go to the house first. That was a decision he made consciously, somewhere on the 40-mile drive back, that showing up at the Carter door before he'd done anything useful would be the wrong kind of return, the kind that was about what he needed rather than what they did. He'd made enough decisions based on what he needed. He was trying to be done with that. He went instead to the east fence line. It was early, just past 6, and the morning light was still thin when he pulled off the road near the section Carol had described. He could see it from the truck, a 30-foot stretch where the wire had been cut clean and the posts worked loose, not the work of an accident or wear, but of someone who'd come out in the dark with tools and intent. The animals had been recovered, apparently. The field was empty now, but the fence was still down and the gap sat there in the morning like a small, deliberate act of cruelty. He found wire and stakes in the bed of his truck. He'd stopped at the hardware store on the way in because he'd known what he'd find and he'd wanted to be able to do something about it immediately. And he spent the next hour and a half repairing the section by himself. While the day came up around him and the birds did what they did in the early morning in that particular place, which he'd learned to identify the way Noah had taught him, which now felt like something he'd carry with him, regardless of how this all resolved. He was finishing the last stake when he heard a vehicle on the road and looked up and saw Daniel's truck slow and stop. Daniel got out and stood at the edge of the road looking at the repaired fence, and then at Ethan, and then at the fence again. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept much in 4 days, which was probably accurate. He had the further look of a man who was recalibrating in real time. "You did that," Daniel said. "Yes. This morning. Just now. Carol called me. He told me about the fence, about the truck that came through your yard." Ethan set down the driver. "I should have come back sooner. I was trying to give you space, and I think I was scared of what I'd find when I came back. That's honest. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cool and quiet, and somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something it considered important. You're scared, Daniel said. Not mocking it, just noting. More than I expected to be, Ethan said. Daniel walked down from the road and crouched at the nearest stake and tested it with his hand, checking the depth, checking the wire tension, the way he checked everything. Not because he doubted, but because thoroughness was simply how he was built. You did this right, he said. You taught me. Daniel stood up. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the repaired stretch, and didn't look at Ethan when he spoke next. I've been angry at you, he said. I want you to know that. I don't usually say that kind of thing out loud, but you've earned the straight version. I know. I took you in because Noah asked me to, and because you seemed like you needed it, and because I've never turned away someone who genuinely needed something if I could help it. He paused. That last part is still true, and it has nothing to do with who you turned out to be. I would have let you stay regardless. That's not the part that bothers me. What's the part that bothers you? The part where we started to trust you. The part where it stopped being charity and started being something else. That's when the lie became something you were choosing to keep in this house with us. He finally looked at Ethan. You had 100 chances to tell us. You knew it too. I could see it sometimes. Yes, Ethan said. Why didn't you? He'd asked himself this enough times in the past 4 days to have something approaching an honest answer. Because I was afraid of losing what I'd found, he said, and I kept telling myself that was different from cowardice. But it wasn't. Daniel was quiet. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the repaired section, looked at them both, and left. Lily isn't doing well, Daniel said finally. I'm not telling you that so you feel worse. I'm telling you because you should know the actual shape of what happened. I know I hurt her. It's not just hurt. Lily, when she gives trust to someone, it costs her something. It's her mother. She'd been holding that tightly for a long time before you got here. He stopped. She doesn't regret trusting you. That's what she said to me. She regrets that the person she trusted turned out to be someone she didn't fully have the information to trust. Ethan felt the distinction like something physical. He stood with it. Is she here? He asked. She's at the diner. She went back to work yesterday. She said sitting home was worse. Daniel pulled his keys from his pocket. Don't go to the diner. Not yet. She needs to come to that on her own time. Okay. But come to supper tonight, Daniel said, and his voice was gruff in a way that covered things he wasn't going to say more elaborately. Noah's been asking about you every day. That's not your fault either, but it's a fact. Ethan nodded. His throat was doing something inconvenient. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me, Daniel said. Just fix what can be fixed and leave the rest alone. He got back in his truck and drove toward the house, and Ethan stood at the fence line for a moment in the early morning and breathed. He spent the day doing what he'd told Martin to do, moving on Victor Hayes. He drove to the county seat and met with a local attorney Martin had arranged, a woman named Sandra Oakes, who had the direct manner of someone who'd spent 20 years in small county practice and had seen most of the ways people could behave badly. He laid out what he knew about the fence, the truck in the yard, the original photographs, the press feeding. Sandra listened with her hands folded and asked 3 specific questions and then said, if we can establish a pattern and tie the fence damage to him, we're looking at criminal mischief and potentially targeted harassment. The press feeding is murkier, but if he gave them information, he had no right to disseminate. The photographs were taken on private road, probably on public easement. That's a gray area. We push on it. Push on it, Ethan said. The photographs he sent you personally. That's more interesting. That's closer to intimidation. What was the intent? To make me uncomfortable. To remind me that he knew something I hadn't disclosed. And he used it. Within a week. Sandra nodded. Get me everything you have, the envelope, the photographs, the printout, the timeline of events afterward. We build the case that this wasn't a private citizen uncovering information. It was a targeted campaign to harm a family he had a personal dispute with. He gave her everything he had and drove back toward Millhaven and stopped at the diner on Route 9, not to go in. He'd told Daniel he wouldn't, but because he was passing it, and he looked through the window as he went by, and he saw her. She was moving between tables with that efficient, absorbed quality that meant she was focused on work and not on the road. And she looked tired in a way that showed in her shoulders, and she looked, regardless of any of that, like herself, which was the thing about her that kept doing something to his chest without asking permission. He didn't stop. He drove past and kept going. He came to supper, and Noah met him at the gate before he'd even gotten out of the truck, which meant either Daniel had told him or he'd simply been watching for the truck, both of which were equally likely. "You came back," Noah said. "I said I would." "You didn't actually say that." Noah was precise about these things. "Fair," Ethan said. "I'm here anyway." Noah studied him with the concentrated assessment of a child running diagnostics. "Are you staying?" "I'm working on it." "Is Lily still mad?" "I don't know. That's up to her." Noah seemed to consider whether this answer was acceptable and concluded that it was. "I told her the truth about you," he said. Ethan looked at him. "What truth is that?" "That you were sad when you got here, in the park. Not hungry sad, just regular sad. The kind of sad that people get when they don't know what they want." He shrugged his small shoulders. "I told her that whatever you did wrong, you came here because something was actually wrong with you, and she should think about that." "What did she say?" "She said I was 10 years old and didn't know what I was talking about." "And?" "And then she was quiet for a long time, which is what she does when she's actually thinking about something." He turned and walked toward the house. "Come on, supper's almost ready." Lily was not at supper that night. She was there. He could hear her in the kitchen, hear the sound of her moving around. But by the time he and Daniel and Noah sat down, she'd taken a plate to her room, which was her right, and he didn't say anything about it, and neither did Daniel, and Noah clearly had been coached not to either, though the coaching was only partially successful because he kept glancing toward the hallway with the transparent innocence of someone trying very hard to be subtle. It was a quieter supper than the ones Ethan remembered from his 2 months here, but it was not an unwelcoming one. Daniel asked him about the attorney. Ethan told him what Sandra Oaks had said. Daniel listened and nodded and said, "Victor's not going to like being pushed back on. Victor's going to have a harder time than not liking it if Sandra does her job." "She good?" "Martin says she's excellent, expensive. I'm covering her fees." Daniel looked at him. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know. Victor came after your family because of me. I'm not going to let you pay attorney fees because of a problem I created." Daniel held his gaze for a moment. There was something in it, not acceptance exactly, but the beginning of the architecture of acceptance. "Fine," he said. "But you tell me everything she does. I'm not being managed in my own situation." "Agreed. And if anything needs a decision from me, it comes through me, not around me." "Understood." "All right then." He picked up his fork. "Eat." Ethan ate. Noah talked about something that had happened at school, involving a science project and a misunderstanding about the combustibility of certain household materials, and Daniel listened with the particular parental expression of a man deciding whether to be amused or alarmed, and Ethan sat at the table and felt the strange double reality of the evening, the warmth of it and the missing piece of it, and said nothing about the missing piece because it wasn't his to say. After supper, he helped Daniel with the dishes the way he always had, and when they were done, Daniel said, "The guest room's still there," without looking at him. Ethan set down the dish he was drying. "Daniel, it's practical," Daniel said. "You're going to be dealing with the attorney, with Victor's people, with whatever else is coming. You shouldn't be driving 40 miles each way every day." He finally looked at him. "This is not me telling you everything is resolved. It isn't. But you can sleep in the room." "Thank you." "Stop thanking me." He hung up his dish towel. "Good night." He woke at 2:15 to the smell of smoke. It wasn't the inside smell of something burning on a stove. It was the outside smell, the one that carried on air, thicker than wood smoke, sharper, with a particular edge that reached into the sleeping brain and activated something animal and old. He was out of bed before he was fully awake, moving on instinct, across the room and to the window. The barn was on fire, not starting to catch, already burning, the east wall fully involved, the fire moving fast in the dry timber of a structure that had stood for 40 years and was now producing light visible from the house with a brightness that didn't belong at 2 in the morning. He could see it clearly through the glass, the orange pulse of it, the smoke rising black above the roofline, and at the edge of his vision, 2 figures running from the access road toward the tree line. He was out the back door in 15 seconds, barefoot on the cold grass, the smoke hitting him properly as he cleared the house. He was shouting Daniel's name before he'd fully thought about it, the way the body shouts when the mind is still catching up. A light went on in the main bedroom. He kept running. The heat reached him 20 yards from the barn, a wall of it, physical and aggressive, pushing against his face and chest. The east wall was fully gone. The south side was catching at the roofline. The main doors were on the west face and hadn't reached the fire yet, and through the gap at the bottom he could see the orange flicker of what was inside. And he understood without having to calculate it that the structure had maybe 8 to 10 minutes before the roof became unstable. He heard Daniel behind him. "The equipment," Daniel said, and his voice was strange, compressed, the voice of a man running the same calculations Ethan had just run. "The tractor, if we lose the tractor." "How many minutes to the near side?" Ethan said. "If I come in from the west door—" "Daniel!" He grabbed his arm. "You're not going in. That tractor cost me— It's insured. Not enough. If I lose the—" And then from inside the barn there was a sound that stopped both of them. Not the sound of timber, not the structural sound of a building failing, but an animal sound, panicked and high. "Murphy," Daniel said. His voice changed entirely. Murphy was the old quarter horse that Daniel had owned for 11 years. He lived in the back stall. Ethan had not been thinking about him, and then he was thinking about nothing else. "West door," Ethan said. "I'm going in." "You're not—" He was already moving. He heard Daniel shout something behind him, and he didn't stop because if he stopped to think about it, he'd process the heat and the smoke and the structural reality, and he wouldn't go in, and that couldn't happen. He pulled his shirt up over his nose, hit the west doors with both palms, and went through. The inside of the barn was not yet fully involved, but it was going. The east wall was a continuous sheet of fire. The south corner was burning from the top down, the old hay in the loft igniting in sections with a sound like something breathing. The smoke was dense enough to reduce visibility to 15 feet, maybe less. He could feel the heat on every exposed surface of his skin, his arms, his face, the tops of his feet on the dirt floor. He found the stall by memory. He'd cleaned it 20 times. He knew where the latch was without needing to see it. Murphy was in the back corner, doing what panicked horses do, which is the worst thing, pressing into the corner rather than toward the door, trembling so hard Ethan could feel it through the wood when he put his hand on the stall boards. He got the latch up, got inside, got his hand on the horse's neck. "Hey," he said. He said it again. He kept his hand on the neck and pressed steady pressure, because pressure was what worked, and he knew that because Noah had shown him when they dealt with Murphy during a thunderstorm 2 months ago, another thing he'd learned in this place that he'd carried without knowing he was carrying it. The horse shifted. Not calm, nowhere near calm, but responsive, movable. He got the lead from the hook by the stall door. He clipped it by feel. He started moving. The south corner came down while he was crossing the floor. Not the whole thing, a section of loft board burning, landing 10 feet to his right with a crash that sent sparks across the dirt. Murphy lurched sideways. Ethan held the lead with both hands and kept moving, kept his voice going, kept saying the same thing over and over in a voice that was supposed to be steadier than it was. The west doors were still clear. He hit them shoulder first and they swung out, and the cold air hit him like a wave, and he kept moving, out into the yard, 30 feet from the barn, 40, until they were clear of the heat radius, and then he stopped and put both hands on Murphy's neck and just breathed. Daniel was there in 10 seconds. He took the lead from Ethan's hands and moved the horse further back, and then he turned and looked at Ethan, and whatever he was going to say, he didn't say it. He just looked at him, in the firelight, with an expression that had several things in it that Ethan was too short of breath to fully interpret. The fire department arrived 11 minutes later. The barn was a loss by then. The roof had come down on the east half, and the fire was working through the structure with the methodical appetite of something that didn't need to hurry. They kept it from reaching the equipment shed and the house. That was what was savable, and they saved it. Lily had come out when the roof came down. He'd heard the noise from inside the house. It was not the kind of noise you slept through. And she was standing in the yard in her jacket over her pajamas when Ethan finally sat down on the tailgate of Daniel's truck because his legs had decided they were done for the moment. His feet were cut from the ground. His arms had burns along the forearms that he'd been aware of as heat and was now beginning to be aware of as something more specific. She came over. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at his arms. You went in, she said. Murphy was in the back stall. You went into a burning barn. Her voice was doing something he couldn't fully classify. Not the careful, measured voice she'd used in the kitchen 4 days ago. Something different, thinner, more exposed. I knew where the stall was, he said. I knew the layout. That's not why I said it. She crouched down in front of him and looked at his forearms and said, "These need to be looked at," and went back to the house and came back with the first aid kit that lived under the kitchen sink, which he knew because he'd been the one to reorganize it 6 weeks ago when he'd found it in disarray. She cleaned his arms without asking whether it was okay, working with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and it stung in the way that told him the burns were real but manageable, and he sat on the tailgate and let her do it and looked at the side of her face in the firelight. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not about the burns. About all of it." "I know," she said. She kept working. "I don't expect that to fix anything." "Good," she said, "because it doesn't." She tied off the last of the bandaging and looked up at him. This close, with the firelight doing what it did, he could see that she'd been crying, which she would hate him knowing, and he said nothing about it. "But I've been sitting in that room for 4 days trying to find a reason not to forgive you, and I keep running into the same problem." "What problem?" She sat back on her heels. "The problem is I know the difference between someone who performed caring for 2 months and someone who actually cared. I've dealt with the first kind before." She glanced at the barn, at the firefighters moving in the smoke. "You came back and fixed the fence before anyone asked. You went into a burning building for an old horse that you had no obligation to." She looked at him again. "Those aren't the actions of a man who was pretending." "They're not," he said. "None of it was pretending. The lie was about my name, about what I had. It was never about what I felt." "The lie was about context," she said, in the careful way of someone who'd been thinking through language for 4 days. "Who you were changed what everything meant. You get that?" "Yes." "And I'm still angry about it." "I know. I'm going to be angry about it for a while longer, probably." "That's fair." She stood up. She put the first aid kit under her arm and looked at him one more time. And what was in her face wasn't forgiveness yet. It was something more complicated than that, something in process. But the wall that had been there 4 days ago in the kitchen was different now, not down, but altered, no longer quite as final. "Come inside when the fire department's done," she said. "Your feet need to be cleaned too." She went back toward the house, and he watched her go and felt something in his chest that was not the relief of a resolved situation, but the more complicated thing of a situation still unresolved but no longer broken. The investigation moved faster than he expected, which he credited to Sandra Oakes, who turned out to be as good as advertised. The 2 figures he'd seen running from the access road had been caught on the camera system from the equipment shed. Old footage, grainy, but clear enough for identification once you knew where to look. They were local men with connections to one of Victor's subcontracting companies. And the connection wasn't hard to establish once someone was looking for it with the correct documents and the willingness to follow the paper. Victor had been careful. He'd used intermediaries. He always did, which was how men like him operated. Enough distance to deny, close enough to be real. But Sandra was thorough in the way of someone who didn't let careful people off the hook just because they'd been careful. And within 10 days of the fire, she had enough to bring to the county sheriff's office. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. Ethan heard about it from Martin, who heard about it from Sandra, who heard about it approximately 90 seconds after it happened, because small counties are small. 2 of Victor's intermediaries were charged with arson and criminal mischief. Victor himself was charged with conspiracy to commit arson and targeted harassment. His attorney released a statement calling the charges politically motivated, which was the statement every attorney released in situations like this because it was the only statement available when you'd actually done the thing. The security footage from the equipment shed was entered into evidence. The photographs Victor had delivered to Ethan, establishing the surveillance relationship, the intimidation attempt, went in behind it. Sandra was quiet and methodical and utterly relentless, and Ethan, who had hired some very good attorneys in his life for various purposes, thought she might be the best he'd encountered. He told her so. "Don't flatter me," she said. "The case is solid because he was sloppy." He thought money meant distance. It doesn't if someone's looking closely enough. He knew something about that particular lesson. The town's response to Victor's arrest was less dramatic than he might have expected and more human. People at the diner talked about it. The hardware store owner Carol called Ethan to say he was glad. There were a few people who'd been aligned with Victor's business interests and who were now quietly realigning, the way towns do when the power structure shifts. Not dramatically, without announcement, just a set of recalculations happening at the individual level. Millhaven had its flaws and its complications, like everywhere, but it also had the quality of a place where people had to live alongside each other for a long time, and had developed, of necessity, a certain practical decency about it. Daniel had his barn to rebuild. Ethan funded it. He did not ask permission, and he expected an argument, which he got one evening after supper when the kids were not around. "I told you I don't want to be managed," Daniel said. "This isn't management. My situation brought Victor's attention to your property. Your barn burned because of that chain of events. I'm paying to rebuild it." "You don't owe me a barn." "I owe you more than a barn," Ethan said. "This is the part that can be measured in money. The rest of it can't." Daniel looked at him for a long time. He was sitting across the kitchen table, which was where the real conversations in this house always happened, and he had the expression of a man running through his objections and finding them, one by one, less solid than his instinct to refuse. "Same design," Daniel said finally. "I don't want it made fancy. Same design. And I'm involved in the build. I'm not just watching men work on my property. You can run the whole thing if you want. I'll fund it. You build it the way you want it." Daniel nodded once. That was agreement. He got up and put the kettle on without asking whether Ethan wanted tea, which was a thing he did for people who were staying, not people who were visiting, and Ethan registered the distinction and said nothing about it. Noah had, in the intervening week, apparently decided that the whole situation was settled, regardless of what the adults thought about it. He'd resumed their morning routine of checking the fence line together before school, and he'd started showing Ethan a new bird call he'd been working on identifying, and he'd asked with complete casualness whether Ethan was going to be there for his school thing in 3 weeks, which was apparently a science presentation he was particularly invested in. "I'm planning on it," Ethan said. "It's on a Tuesday," Noah said, "in case you have meetings." "I'll rearrange the meetings." "Okay." He paused. "Lily said she'd come too." Ethan didn't react to this, at least not outwardly. "Good," he said. "I told her you were coming," Noah said, with the calm precision of someone laying a hand of cards on the table. "She said she was glad." He shrugged. "I thought you should know." Ethan looked at him. The kid was 10 years old and was, without question, the most effective human being in this entire situation. He'd been effective since the park bench, and he had not stopped, and Ethan suspected he would not stop for the rest of his natural life. "Thank you, Noah," he said. "You keep thanking me," Noah said. "Just do good things. That's better." I was right about that too. The evening before the barn construction was due to start, Ethan was sitting on the back steps, the steps that had accumulated more weight, more real conversation, more of the substance of the past several months than any other physical location he could name, when the back door opened and Lily came out and sat down next to him. Not across from him, not with careful distance. Next to him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She had a mug of tea. She didn't offer him any, which meant she'd decided to sit down before she'd made it, which meant she'd decided to sit down and then made it quickly, which meant something. They sat for a while without talking. The evening was cooling off, and the sky above the ridge had gone from orange to a deep, bruised blue that was close to violet, and the farm sounds were the evening sounds, lower and more dispersed than the morning ones. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited. "About what you said. About wanting to know if someone could love, the actual person, without the rest of it." She turned her mug in her hands. "I understand what you were looking for. I do. The way you went about it was wrong," he said. "Yes, it was." She looked at the ridge. "But the thing underneath it, the loneliness underneath it, I recognize that." He looked at her. "I've been lonely too," she said, and she said it plainly, without making anything out of it. "Not the same way. But I've been managing this family and this farm and that diner for 6 years, and I haven't let anyone in far enough to make it complicated, because complicated meant I might lose focus, and if I lost focus, things fell apart." She stopped. "And then you showed up and you were in the room. Actually, in the room. And I let you in anyway, and it turns out the complicated thing is what I was afraid of, and also the only thing I actually wanted." He was very still. I'm not over being angry, she said. I know. And I need you to never do anything like that again. Not the hiding, not the waiting. Whatever is true, you tell me. Yes, he said. No hesitation. She finally looked at him, turned her head, and they were close enough that the distance between them was a decision rather than a given. And what was in her face in that moment was something that had cost her. The anger still there, the hurt still there, and underneath it all the thing she'd been trying to sort out in her room for a week and a half, which was that the feeling hadn't left just because the situation was complicated. Feelings having very little respect for the logical frameworks you tried to put around them. Okay, she said. Just that. He reached over and covered her hand with his, the hand that was holding the mug, and she didn't pull away. They sat like that while the blue went darker above the ridge, and the farm went quiet around them, and there was nothing solved yet, nothing completed. The barn still needed building, and the legal case was still ongoing, and there was still the long work of trust being rebuilt from what it had been before. But in that particular moment, none of that was the point. The point was the step, and the evening, and two people sitting close enough to feel the warmth of each other deciding, imperfectly and without guarantees, that the work was worth doing. The barn went up over 3 weeks in October, and it was not a smooth process. The lumber delivery came 2 days late because of a supplier issue that Ethan handled with a phone call, but that still cost them time. One of the contractors had a disagreement with Daniel on the second day about the placement of the interior supports. Daniel wanted them where they'd always been. The contractor had a more efficient modern layout in mind. And it became the kind of standoff that only resolves when one party accepts that it's not actually their barn. The contractor accepted this eventually. The interior supports went where Daniel wanted them. Ethan worked alongside the crew most days, not because he was needed, but because standing to the side watching felt wrong, in a way he couldn't justify to himself. He'd gotten used to using his hands. He'd gotten used to the particular satisfaction of a day that ended with something physically different from how it had started. He wasn't as fast as the crew, and he made mistakes that required correction, but he was present and willing, and by the second week the lead contractor had stopped looking at him like a liability and started pointing him toward tasks that needed doing without being asked. Daniel watched this without comment, which was Daniel's way of commenting. Lily came by the site in the evenings after her shift, not every day but most days, and there was a quality to her presence that had changed from what it had been a month ago. Something looser, less armored, though the armor hadn't disappeared entirely, and he didn't expect it to. She was not a woman who was going to love easily or trust without memory of the cost. He understood that, and he didn't push against it. He let things move at the speed they moved. They talked, properly, the way they hadn't been able to when he'd been managing what he showed her. He told her about Cincinnati, about the storage unit, about the 8 months of peanut butter sandwiches. He told her about his mother, who had worked night shifts at a hospital laundry and never once complained about it in his hearing, and who had died of a stroke 4 years ago in a house he'd bought her that was far nicer than anything she'd asked for, and how the thing he thought about most was not the house, but whether she'd actually been happy in it, whether the niceness of it had felt like home or like something foreign that her son had imposed on her life because he didn't know how else to give her something. Was she happy? Lily asked. They were sitting on what remained of the old fence by the equipment shed, in the particular slant of late afternoon light that October made in that part of the country. I think so, he said. I think she was proud, and also a little confused by me for the last part of her life. She didn't entirely understand what I did or how I'd gotten to doing it. He stopped. She used to call the company my thing. How's your thing going, she'd say, like it was a hobby I'd taken too far. Lily smiled. I like her. She would have had opinions about you, he said. Good or bad. She had two modes with women I was involved with. Either she was polite in a way that communicated complete indifference, or she said exactly what she thought. She only said what she thought about people she considered worth her honesty. Which mode for me? He looked at her. She'd have asked you about the farm within the first 5 minutes, and whether you were eating enough, and then she'd have told you something embarrassing about me that she'd been holding in reserve. I would have liked that, Lily said quietly. Yeah, he said. I know. These were the conversations that rebuilt things, not the dramatic ones, not the apologies, not the formal accounting of wrong and right, but the ordinary ones that required you to actually be known. Ethan had spent years performing being known. He was learning the difference, slowly and with the imperfect attention of someone who kept reverting to old habit before catching himself, between the performance and the actual thing. He caught himself doing it one evening when Lily asked him a straightforward question about what he wanted, and he started to answer in the careful, strategic way he'd always answered personal questions, shaping the response for desired effect, and stopped mid-sentence. "What?" she said. "I was about to tell you the version I thought you'd like instead of the actual version." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me the actual version." He did. It was less polished and slightly more vulnerable than the shaped version, and she received it without making it a bigger deal than it was, which was exactly the right response. And he felt the distinction between the two answers sitting in his chest like a lesson he was going to have to keep relearning. "You do that less than you used to," she said. "I'm working on it." "I know." She looked at the half-finished barn. "It's annoying when you catch yourself, isn't it?" "Extremely." "I do it too," she said. "Different version. I manage instead of feeling. I figure out what needs to happen practically, so I don't have to figure out what I actually need." She said this without self-pity, the way she said most honest things. "My dad pointed it out when I was about 22, and I told him he was wrong, and then I spent 3 years proving him right." "What changed?" "Nothing dramatic. I just got tired." She turned to look at him. "Tired of being so competent that nobody thought to ask if I was okay." She paused. "You asked. Not in words most of the time. But you were the first person in a long time who just sat with me when I needed sitting with." He thought about the morning on the steps when she'd had cold coffee and the going somewhere else look. He thought about all the times he'd just stayed, without pushing, without filling the silence. He was glad now that that part of him had been right, even when other parts were getting it badly wrong. Noah's science presentation was on the third Tuesday in October and was, by any objective measure, the most thorough examination of local bird populations that Millhaven Elementary had witnessed in recent memory. He had a poster with hand-drawn illustrations that showed genuine observational detail, and he could identify calls for 7 species, and his conclusion that bird diversity in an area was a reliable indicator of ecosystem health was delivered with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and was pleased to finally have a formal venue for it. Ethan sat in the third row of plastic chairs between Lily and Daniel in a room full of parents and siblings, and a teacher who was clearly delighted by the material, even if some of the other parents were checking their phones, and watched Noah present and felt something that was not easy to name, but was large and warm and had to do with the specific texture of being somewhere you belonged. Noah caught his eye at the end of the presentation when the teacher was asking questions, and the look he gave was 10 years old in its transparency, checking that the important people were there, confirming that what he'd done had landed. Ethan gave a small nod. Noah looked away quickly, professionally, like he was above that kind of approval-seeking, and Ethan looked at the ceiling for a second to compose himself. "He practiced that call for 2 weeks, Lily said quietly next to him. "The nuthatch one. He kept doing it in the kitchen until Dad told him to go do it in the barn. He's got it now. He has you to thank for that." He looked at her. She was watching Noah, not him, but there was something in her profile that was open in a way he was still getting used to seeing. "He taught himself," Ethan said. "I just paid attention while he did it." "That's not nothing," she said, "for a kid who lost his mother at 4. Having someone pay attention." She stopped, and he didn't push, and after a moment she said, "He doesn't really remember her. He thinks he does, but most of what he remembers is what I've told him. He's been practicing those bird calls for a man who showed up in a park and gave him his lunch back." He was quiet for a long time after that. The Victor Hayes case moved toward its conclusion through November with the unhurried momentum of legal processes that are properly documented and not going anywhere. 3 hearings, 2 continuances, a motion to dismiss that Sandra dealt with efficiently and without drama. Victor's attorneys were good, which Ethan had expected. Men like Victor always had good attorneys. But the evidence was better. The security footage from the equipment shed identified both men hired for the arson with enough clarity to constitute solid grounds. The connection to Victor's subcontracting company held under examination. The photographs and the printout he'd sent to Ethan, delivered by hand, a decision that turned out to be the most legally consequential thing Victor had done, established the intimidation campaign in writing, almost literally. Sandra called Ethan on a Wednesday in late November with the voice of someone delivering expected news. He took the plea, she said. Terms? Criminal conspiracy, targeted harassment, accessory to arson, substantial fine, 3 years probation, 2 of which are supervised. He won't do time unless he violates conditions, which his attorney will make sure he doesn't. She paused. I want you to know I pushed for more. I know you did. The DA wanted a clean close. That's the reality of county prosecution resources. Sandra, he stopped her. It's enough. He's not going to come near the Carter family again, right? The protective order is part of the agreement. Any contact in probation converts to sentence. Then it's enough, he said. He told Daniel that evening. Daniel sat with it for a moment and then said, I didn't want him to go to prison particularly. I just wanted him to stop. He stopped. Daniel nodded. That was the end of it for Daniel, or at least the end of the part that needed discussing. He was not a man who needed to extract satisfaction from punishment. He was a man who needed things to stop being a problem so he could get back to the actual work of his life, which was the farm and his family and the quiet, persistent business of getting through seasons. The barn was finished the first week of December. Daniel walked through it alone on the morning it was completed, and Ethan waited outside with the lead contractor, who had the diplomatic sense to also wait without speaking. When Daniel came back out, his face was composed in the particular way of someone who just experienced something privately significant and wasn't going to talk about it, and he shook the contractor's hand and said it was good work, and that was that. Later that day, he found Ethan at the equipment shed and said simply, Thank you for the barn. It's the least of it, Ethan said. I know. Daniel leaned against the shed wall. I've been thinking about something. I want to say it straight. Go ahead. When you came here, you were looking for something, whether someone could love you for the man you actually were. That was the question. He looked at him. I think you got your answer, but I want you to understand something about what gave you that answer. Ethan waited. It wasn't Lily, mostly, Daniel said, or Noah. It was you. He held up a hand before Ethan could say anything. Not the money, not the choices you made about hiding it, the other you. The man who showed up every morning before he needed to, who fixed things before he was asked, who went into a burning building without thinking about it. He paused. That man was already there. The money didn't make him, and it didn't hide him. He just needed somewhere he couldn't hide behind the money long enough to find out he was there. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The wind came off the ridge and moved through the bare trees at the property line with a sound that had more space in it now than in summer. My father left when I was 9, he said. It was not something he said easily or often. He didn't say goodbye. One day he was there, and then he wasn't, and the furniture was gone. I spent a long time thinking there was something about me specifically that made it possible for a person to just leave without it costing them anything. And I built the company because it was proof that I was worth something, that I couldn't be that easily discarded. He looked at his hands, the hands that were different now, that had learned something. But proof requires an audience, and the audience I kept attracting were people who were performing right back at me, so nothing ever felt real, and I kept needing more proof. Until you got rid of the proof, Daniel said. Until I didn't have any proof, Ethan said, and found out I didn't need it. Daniel pushed off the wall. That's worth knowing, he said, and went back toward the house. And Ethan stood in the cold air by the equipment shed and thought that it was, possibly, the most valuable thing he'd ever been given, and that it had cost nothing and everything at the same time. He asked Lily to marry him in February, and it was not a perfect proposal. He'd had a plan. He'd thought about locations, about the right moment, about what he wanted to say. And then it happened, not according to the plan, but during an argument about whether to plant the East Field with the same crop rotation Daniel had been using for 6 years, or try something different that the County Agricultural Extension had been recommending. They were in the kitchen, and they'd been going back and forth for 20 minutes about soil composition, which had shifted into a broader conversation about whether a person could keep doing the same thing because it was familiar, or whether familiar was just another word for afraid to change. And in the middle of that conversation, which was not romantic and was not resolved and was in fact still ongoing, Ethan looked at her and understood that this was exactly what the rest of his life was supposed to look like. The argument, the kitchen, the cold coffee neither of them had touched, her hair coming out of the clip she'd put it in that morning. the ridge through the window under February sky. "Lily," he said. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at him because his voice had changed registers. "What?" she said. "I want to marry you." She stared at him. "Right now? We're in the middle of—" "Not right now. I mean, yes, right now I'm asking, but the wedding doesn't have to be right now." He stopped. He did not have the words arranged the way he'd planned. "I know this isn't the moment I had designed. I had a different moment designed, but I think I've learned something about designed moments. That they don't work? That they're for the performance of the thing instead of the thing itself." He looked at her steadily. "I love you. I love your father and your brother and this farm and this ridiculous conversation about crop rotation. I love that you argue with me about things that matter to you and that you don't let me win just because arguing is uncomfortable. I want all of it, every difficult day of it." She was very still. Not the careful stillness of someone managing their reaction, the actual stillness of someone who had been reached. "You don't have a ring," she said. "No," he said. "I have terrible timing and a half-finished argument about soil composition." Something broke open in her face. Not cleanly, not dramatically, but in the human way things broke open. With complexity still in it, with the history of what they'd been through still visible, with the full acknowledgement that this was not a story where everything had been fixed so much as a story where two imperfect people had decided the work was worth it. "Yes," she said. He got the ring 2 weeks later. She came with him to choose it, which was not traditional and also completely right, because she knew what she wanted and had no patience for surprises that could have been avoided by asking, which was one of the things he loved about her. They were married in June, on the Carter property, in the yard between the house and the new barn. It was not a large wedding, it was not a lavish wedding. Daniel had said, when the subject came up, that he didn't mind what kind of wedding it was, as long as the food was decent, and it didn't run past 9 o'clock because he had to be up at 5 regardless. And Lily had laughed and said those were her requirements too, and that had settled most of the planning questions. There were people from town, Carol from the hardware store, the woman who ran the post office and had given Ethan his first piece of local mail addressed to a name other than his own, the crew who'd built the barn, a handful of Lily's friends who'd come from various distances with the particular warmth of people who'd been waiting for this news. Ethan's sister came from Portland and stood next to him before the ceremony started and looked around the yard with an expression that was trying to be composed and not quite managing it. "This is where you've been," she said. Not accusatory, something more like wonder. "This is where I've been," he said. "You look different," she said. "I know." "Good different." She squeezed his arm. "Mom would have—" She stopped. "I know," he said. Noah was the one who walked Lily across the yard. He'd asked to do it himself weeks before the wedding, in the matter-of-fact way he proposed things he'd already decided. He was 11 now, taller than he'd been, with the beginning of the seriousness that would characterize him as an adult, visible already in the way he carried himself. He walked his sister with a gravity that was entirely genuine and slightly formal and completely his own, and when he placed her hand in Ethan's, he looked at Ethan with an expression that contained somehow both the 10-year-old who'd offered a sandwich in a park and the man he was already in the process of becoming. "Take care of her," Noah said. "I will," Ethan said. "Every day." Noah nodded and stepped back and took his place next to Daniel, who was not crying, but who was doing the thing that men of Daniel's particular character did when they were feeling something large, standing very straight and looking at something in the middle distance with careful attention. The ceremony was short and direct. Lily had written her own words, which surprised no one. She said she'd learned that trust was not a feeling but a practice, and that she was choosing to practice it with him every day, knowing it would be imperfect, and knowing imperfect was the only version that was real. She said she was not interested in a life without difficult conversations, and she was glad she'd found someone who wasn't either. She said she loved him, and she said it the way she said everything important, plainly, without performance, with the full weight of what she meant behind it. He said that he'd driven away from everything he had in search of something he couldn't name, and he'd found it in a town he hadn't planned to stop in, given to him by people who had no obligation to give him anything. He said he understood, now, that the question he'd been asking, whether someone could love the man without the money, had been the wrong question. The right question was whether he was the kind of man worth loving. And he said that the Carters had answered that question not by loving him in spite of his imperfections, but by holding him accountable for them, and that was the more valuable gift. He said he intended to spend the rest of his life being worth it. Lily smiled at that. The real smile, the one that took over her whole face when she wasn't managing it. And the afternoon light was doing something specific in the June air, and the yard that had been a site of fire and recrimination and repair was simply a yard full of people who meant something to each other. The rest followed as it does, imperfectly and with interruptions. The foundation was Ethan's idea, but it took shape in conversation with Daniel and Lily over several months at the kitchen table, with coffee going cold the way coffee always went cold in that kitchen, because the conversations were more important than the temperature. He'd been thinking about the question that had started all of it, loneliness specifically. The particular species of it he'd experienced, being surrounded by people, invisible to no one. But also the other kind, the kind Daniel Carter knew about, being held too far from help by pride or circumstance or simply by the fact that small towns had limited resources, and the people who lived in them didn't always have access to what they needed. The Cross Community Foundation was incorporated in September of that year. It was not named with the grandiosity that Ethan had, in his previous life, applied to the naming of things. It was named pragmatically, his name, because people needed to know who was accountable for it, and community and foundation because those were the accurate words for what it was. It focused, specifically and without distraction, on two things: programs for isolated elderly people in rural areas and emergency resources for farm families facing financial crisis. It was not a comprehensive solution to either problem. Ethan was careful not to describe it as one, because he'd spent enough time in the reality of both situations to understand that the gap between a foundation's resources and the actual scale of need was always humbling, and humility was something he was working to keep. What the foundation did was small and specific and real. It funded a network of regular contact programs, people who called isolated elderly individuals weekly, not to sell them anything or assess them, but simply to talk, to ask how they were doing, to listen. It funded emergency operating loans for farm families one bad season away from losing land that had been in their families for generations. It funded, in Millhaven specifically, a community resource center that occupied the empty storefront next to Carol's hardware store and provided practical assistance with the paperwork-heavy processes that rural residents were often navigating alone. Medical assistance applications, agricultural relief programs, the bureaucratic labyrinth of getting help from systems that required you to know they existed. The center in Millhaven was run by a woman named Patrice, who'd been a social worker in the county for 20 years and who Lily had recommended without hesitation. And Patrice ran it with an efficiency and warmth that Ethan recognized. The efficiency of someone who'd learned to love the work rather than the idea of the work. He visited the center on a Thursday morning in its second month of operation and found Patrice sitting across a table from an elderly man named Harold, who was trying to appeal a medical coverage decision and who had, by his own account, received 3 contradictory pieces of advice from 3 different sources and was no longer certain which end was up. Patrice was reading the denial letter with the focused, unruffled attention of someone who'd seen this pattern before and knew exactly what it said beneath what it said. "This is a standard denial for incomplete documentation," she said to Harold, "which is different from a denial on grounds. You still have a right to appeal, and you have a strong case. I've seen worse go through." "Last time I tried to deal with this sort of thing," Harold said, "I spent 4 hours on the phone and got nowhere." "You don't have to do it on the phone," Patrice said. "I'll submit the written appeal on your behalf. You sign it, and I'll handle the filing." She looked up at him. "You're not doing this alone, Harold. That's the whole point of this place." Harold looked at her the way people looked when they'd been managing things alone for so long that the offer of actual help felt slightly unreal. Ethan had seen that look before. He'd seen it on his own face, in a hotel mirror in a city he'd been trying to leave, before he'd found a road that led somewhere. He didn't interrupt. He waited until Harold had left with copies of the documentation and a clear next step, and then he and Patrice sat at the table and went through the operating numbers for the month. Not smoothly, because the numbers had a gap in the outreach staffing budget that needed addressing. And he wrote the check and she accepted it without making it sentimental, because sentiment wasn't what the work required. He drove home in the late afternoon, through Millhaven on the main street past Carol's and the diner and the post office and the park with the gazebo that had needed painting and now had it, and he made the turn onto the dirt road that had become the most familiar road he knew. The farm in December looked different from the farm in the summer he'd arrived. The trees were bare and the fields put to rest, and the new barn stood at the east side of the property with the clean lines of new construction that hadn't yet acquired the weathered dignity the old one had possessed. It would, in time. Things acquired their character through use and endurance, not through design. He parked and came through the gate and found Lily at the kitchen table, which was where she often was in the late afternoon. Not always with accounts or practical things, sometimes just with a book or a cup of tea, taking the 20 minutes before supper preparation that she'd started allowing herself in the past year, in the way of someone learning, slowly and imperfectly, to stop managing long enough to exist. She looked up when he came in. "How was the center?" she asked. "Good." He sat down across from her. "Patrice is very good." "I told you." "You did." He took off his jacket. "There's a staffing gap I need to fix in Q1. Fix it." "I will." He looked at her. She had the book face down on the table, closed on her place without a bookmark, which she always did, and which meant she either had a very good memory for page numbers or lost her place regularly and refused to admit it. He'd asked once. She'd looked at him as if the question were beneath both of them. "Noah called," she said. "He wants to know if you're coming to the thing next month." The thing next month was Noah's middle school science fair, for which he'd been preparing, with characteristic intensity, a project on the effect of light pollution on nocturnal bird behavior, which had grown out of the original bird identification work that had grown out of sitting on a porch looking at unusually clear stars. The chain of it ran back through everything, the way chains did when you followed them carefully. "I'm coming," Ethan said. "He'll be glad," she said. "I know." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The same gesture from the back steps, the same hands, but changed. And she turned hers over and held it back in the easy, unperformed way of people who'd been doing something long enough for it to become natural. There was no drama in the moment. There was nothing cinematic about the kitchen, the bare winter light through the window, the sound of the farm outside. There was just the ordinary weight of a life that was actually his. Not built to impress anyone, not arranged for effect, not performed for an audience he'd been trying for years to convince of something. There was a woman across the table who knew what he was worth and chose him anyway, not because he'd hidden his flaws, but because she'd seen them clearly and decided the whole person was what she wanted. There was a father-in-law who corrected his fence work and passed him the bread without ceremony, and had said, once, in the particular straightness of a man with no room for unnecessary words, that whatever else Ethan Cross was or had been, he was a man who showed up. And in Daniel Carter's estimation, that was the foundation of everything else a person could claim to be. There was a boy who had started something with a peanut butter sandwich offered to a stranger on a bench, without calculation, without agenda, simply because it seemed like the right thing to do. Who had been right about that. Who was right about most things, if you watched carefully and had the patience not to underestimate him. And there was the work. The foundation, the center, Patrice sitting across a table from Harold with the patience of someone who understood that practical help was its own form of love. The form that didn't ask to be thanked, that didn't require the person receiving it to feel anything in particular about it, that just did the thing that needed doing and moved on to the next one. This was what the money had always been for, not the proof, not the display, not the attempt to purchase something that was never for sale. Just this. The capacity to help, applied in places where help was actually needed, by a man who'd had to lose himself first before he understood what he was supposed to use himself for. The world didn't give people like Ethan Cross easy lessons. It gave them everything they'd asked for first, all the things they'd decided success meant, and then sat back and waited for them to figure out why none of it was enough. Some people figured it out, and some people didn't, and the ones who didn't spent their whole lives building higher and acquiring more and dying in possession of proof that no one, in the end, actually needed to see. He'd gotten lucky. Not in the way people usually meant when they said that. Not lucky with money or with timing or with deals. Lucky that he'd been lonely enough and honest enough about being lonely to get in a truck and drive away from everything he had. Lucky that Noah Carter had looked at a man on a bench and seen not a stranger but a person who needed a sandwich. Lucky that Daniel Carter had opened a gate. Lucky that a woman with cold coffee and a going somewhere else look had decided he was in the room and let herself be right about it, even after everything that made being right about it complicated. Luck wasn't really the word for any of it. The word was something closer to grace, not the kind that comes from above, but the kind that comes sideways from other people, offered without guarantee of return, accepted by someone who finally had the sense to put down what he'd been carrying long enough to receive it. The light changed in the kitchen as the afternoon went. He and Lily stayed at the table a while longer than they needed to. Outside, the new barn held the cold. The fields rested under the winter, and the ridge above the property line caught the last of the day and held it, briefly, before letting it go. That was enough. It was at last more than enough.